next question is, what can you do to stop this kind of stuff? And so there's one that Nick mentioned, Quick Assist. So one option that you have there is to simply uninstall it. You can do this through SCCM. You can do this through endpoint management. You can do this through a number of ways. But basically, unless your organization, your IT support, I guess, is using this, you should uninstall it. Nick mentioned in the chat logs how he saw it a lot. They're using it, and it's much easier than getting the victim to download AnyDesk or any one of those kinds of remote management tools. It's built into Windows. It's super easy. You basically just send them a code. They put the code in, and you're good to go. And so, unless you're using this across the enterprise, you should definitely get rid of it. I mean, there's always going to be MFA. I don't know that I need to go on about that one. Enable MFA. It was the biggest data breach in US. It was the biggest breach of US PHI in history with Change Healthcare. Nick showed a screenshot before about how they were doing credential stuffing, and that whole screenshot, and he even said it, that constantly they're looking for Citrix hosts with credential stuffing. This is exactly what happened with Change Healthcare last year. And I believe it was 200 million Americans PHI was exfiltrated because Change Healthcare had a Citrix host that was facing the public internet, and the threat actors used credential stuffing on that Citrix host and gained access that way. There was no MFA enabled, so enable MFA, right? Enable MFA, get rid of Quick Assist. You got to do it. You should always be performing user access reviews as well. So if your organization is part of or is taking part in ISO 27001 or a couple other frameworks, this is required. So you probably should be doing it anyways. But you should be looking and seeing: are you decommissioning old accounts? Are you offboarding people? Are there test accounts that are sitting in there with password 123 or whatever it might be? But you should routinely perform user access reviews. And like Nick had mentioned with Kerberoasting has a big focus on service accounts in on-prem Active Directory. And so you want to, make sure that you pay particular attention to that. There's cases where I know, that Nick's been on engagements, for example, and he's performed Kerberoasting, and at times gotten 100 service accounts, right, or more, and they all had weak passwords. So, you can take when you do Kerberoasting, you basically get a list of service accounts and their hashes, and you can take those hashes and crack them with Hashcat or John the Ripper or whatever. So there are a lot of those service accounts, which again, they're probably 80% of those service accounts in that particular example were probably no longer in use. And not only that, but they had weak passwords. That's one way that you can, you can kind of work through that issue of Kerberoasting. Just the way that on-prem AD works, the threat actor is going to be able to grab those hashes. But if they have really strong passwords and yes, 24 characters, I know that's crazy, but again, these are service accounts, right? These aren't just everyday user accounts. So they should, and those service accounts have extremely high privileges. So yes, give it a long password, multi-character, so that if that hash is grabbed by someone, they wouldn't be able to just crack it, because that's exactly what they're going to try to do. So MFA, remove Quick Assist, perform user access reviews, pay specific attention to those service accounts, where Nick had mentioned Kerberoasting, and that's just kind of the start. As far as monitoring goes, so Nick and I were talking a little bit there, and I forget exactly what Nick said, but he said something to the effect of basically, so EDR should have been able to pick up when those files hit disk, right? Or he was talking about some of the fork and run method with Cobalt Strike and how EDR, almost all of them see it. And so use EDR. I mean, even if it's Windows Defender, use something. It'll block a lot of these basic TTPs, the low hanging fruit, if you will, so that you make it much more difficult for them to actually operate. Right. We talked a lot about data extortion or double extortion and data exfiltration. One thing that you can do is, if they're exfiltrating, these large amounts of data, there should be some sort of network monitoring in place, or your EDR should be able to catch that. Most EDRs nowadays can. Most of the time, actually, the big thing that's been around for probably I don't know, a couple of years now is XDR, which is a mixture of EDR and network detection and response. So when you put these two together, monitoring the endpoint and then actually monitoring the network traffic, you should be able to see that large amounts of data are coming off the network, right? And you'd be alerted on that and block it in most cases. When we do adversary emulation engagements, we will attempt to exfil large files just to see what happens. And in the times that we do get caught, it's because the network monitoring, aka XDR, um, saw that there was a large amount of data going out. And now that I think I might answer my own question is when I asked Nick about the FTP, maybe one reason that they were doing it, they were exfiltrating that data to FTP servers, is that maybe it would fly under the radar of network monitoring, right? But you should be paying attention to things that are going on the endpoint and things that are going on in the network. A good place to start is Wuzzo. Wuzzo is an open source um, monitoring tool. Well, it's more than a tool platform. If you're a smaller or medium sized organization, this is a great place to start. There are enterprise offerings too, so it allows you to grow, right, as the organization gets bigger. But it is open source. Anyone can set it up. It's a good starting point. Of course, CrowdStrike is going to be appropriate for pretty much any organization, and will be able to handle a lot of these things. But basically, implement some sort of EDR network monitoring. The other option is, uh, if you're a big organization, you might be at the point where DLP, data loss prevention, is something that the organization needs to employ or is getting ready to employ. And so, uh, if you can employ something like Purview from Microsoft that does a lot of DLP, not that's what Purview does. It does DLP. Uh, you can um, use that for various exfiltration techniques and allow it to alert on you. Just this week, Microsoft actually released a whole bunch of security agents, so AI agents. One of those was the Microsoft Purview Agentic AI, I believe is the name of it, to where it works with your Microsoft DLP solution Purview, but it's an AI assisted method for DLP, and for it'll also allow. So there's another agent that Microsoft just released that has to do with alerting as well. The ones that they released were specifically Microsoft Security Agentic AI. There's a whole bunch of them. I would recommend, if you're a Microsoft shop, to go check those out. Um, I'm sure we've all just been getting bugged by Microsoft for months now about Copilot and how great Copilot is. Uh, it's not bad. I think these agentic AI solutions are a step in the right direction. Uh, I do think that there's a lot of helpful stuff that they can use, that can be used by these agents. Just side note, I do have concerns about the data privacy and data security with those. So, for example, Copilot. If you're using Copilot in your tenant, it has access to everything. Well, there's controls you can put in place, but it basically has access to data in your tenant. So by default, it has access to all the data in your tenant. So it has access to stuff in SharePoint, in Teams, and you name it, right? Power BI, whatever it is, Copilot has access to all that stuff. Um, and so I came super close. So you can ask Copilot, hey, give me a summary of all the emails between me and Nick, and it'll read my emails, it'll read Nick's emails, and it'll give you a summary. I came super close to getting it to show me our CEO's emails. Super close. But that's a story for another time. Point being, these security agents are the right step forward. There are still some concerns, but it's an excellent option if you're, a mature enterprise looking to, implement some additional protections. And of course, YARA rules. So if you aren't familiar with YARA rules, they're basically a framework for creating alerts and various logging and monitoring software. Most EDR platforms will actually give you the ability to create them or actually create it for you. So in CrowdStrike, for example, you can, if you see a specific action taken on an endpoint, it'll generate that YAR rule for you. So you can literally just copy it and put it into your, whatever else you're using. But these YAR rules are out there. There's plenty of them for free, right? If you just go and look for, ransomware TTP YAR rules, you're going to see a whole bunch of them. They're a great way to be alerted when these types of things happen and kind of keep them up to date. But yeah, I mean, we're basically getting at do the basics, right? Do the basics is kind of what we're getting at here, if you haven't noticed. One other area that we think is important when it comes to defending against these types of attacks is around identity and access management. I like these are all 95% of ransomware attacks are done on traditional on-prem Windows Active Directory networks. And so there's a lot of different things that can happen. And of course, now with everything with Entra ID and having, cloud-based, basically Entra ID is just Azure AD. I mean, it's a cloud-based version, but they sync together, right? So just because your organization is primarily on-prem Active Directory, but if you employ Entra ID, there's ways that threat actors can pivot from public cloud services in Azure down into your on-prem Windows Active Directory network. And so uh, one thing that we want to always make sure that we're looking at is we want to perform regular review of enterprise applications in Entra ID. So last year, when the Russian SVR compromised the Microsoft corporate tenant, they did that through basically an enterprise application had a connection between a test tenant of Microsoft's and then their corporate tenant. And so the threat actors through that application were able to pivot through because that application had permissions in both tenants. A common attack that you see is called an illicit grant attack, to where threat actors will, through some sort of phishing page or other social engineering, ask a user to accept the permissions for an application. So they will make a Microsoft app. Uh, they will send a link to the user, and maybe that app is called Document Review. They'll send a link to the user, and they'll say, hey user, you have important HR documents to sign. Please click this button to sign them. And what will happen is it'll bring them to the OAuth login, and the user will then grant access to that application, right? And so that's considered an illicit grant. And that application now has all those permissions that it asks of the user. It can then gain access to all the user's info, whatever that user has access to in Azure or wherever else that application now has access to. If the user performed that grant for the access. And so we always want to take a look at enterprise applications. You can do that in your tenant. And it's a big pathway because just because it's Entra ID and the organization might be completely on-prem Active Directory, there's plenty of ways for them to pivot from the cloud down to, the on-prem. Talked about it already, but perform user and group access reviews in your IAM. IAM, especially in Entra, AWS, etc., is an absolute nightmare. I think we're kind of familiar with that. But you want to make sure that you're performing those. Before we mentioned making sure that you're looking at the service accounts in on-prem Active Directory. But again, you want to make sure that groups are cleaned up and users are decommissioned when they don't need to be around anymore.
Hey, Corey, you kind of just answered it, but we had a question come in. Any recommended method to perform access reviews?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can script it. So, um, Gabe, who does RIT, actually scripted it out to where he dumps all the users. Gabe, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is what Gabe does. He dumps all the users from Entra, and then he pulls them from all of our other tooling, and can actually basically gather all the users together and what tools they have access to. That's and then we basically all go through them. So the way that he did it actually made things a lot easier because you can see whether or not the user is active. In bigger organizations, this is definitely a challenge. There's no question about it. But I think the good place to start is to just go into, again, sticking with Microsoft, is to go into Entra ID, export the users, and then so for example, a lot of big companies have contractors. This is something we see all the time. So a good place to start is to go through your contractors and see, is this contractor active or not? Um, the way that'll make user access reviews even easier is if you have proper onboarding and offboarding for IT. If you're doing offboarding when someone is, leaves or is let go, when it comes time to do those, especially with Entra, um, it'll make your lives 10 times easier. But there's other tooling out there as well that can help you with it. But at the end of the day, user access reviews is a manual. It's a pretty manual task. The hardest part is just getting the data in the same place so you don't have to keep moving around. Which again, for us, Gabe scripts that together and basically gets it into an Excel sheet that all the managers go and review at some point or another. So we do it quarterly. It's gonna be a challenge. I wish I had better information, but it's gonna suck. Just the way it is. The other one that I wanted to call out was during proactive testing. So if you're doing pen testing or red teaming or anything else, make sure that you're performing OSINT and collecting breach data and testing that. So the example I gave before was Change Healthcare. We know for a fact that ransomware crews from the screenshot Nick shared, we know for a fact that ransomware crews are just looking at Citrix. They just want Citrix, and they are literally taking breach data and doing credential stuffing to see if they can get into that Citrix host. So if you're doing any sort of testing already, which you probably are, you should absolutely 100% include things like OSINT gathering, because that will get you the information around breach data and then allow those testers to use that breach data, because that's a huge attack surface. And you'll be able to identify misconfigurations in things like conditional access policies. You'll be able to find out whether or not you have breach data, you have active credentials in use that are in breach data. So I would absolutely 100% recommend. Of course, I'm the offset guy, but I would 100% recommend that you include OSINT gathering, breach data collection, and additional reconnaissance whenever you're doing any sort of penetration testing. And this one, you kind of have to call it out: least privilege. So this comes with having good strategies around providing permissions to the users that are in either your tenant or whatever the account is, whether maybe it's AWS. But zero trust has been talked about. It comes in waves. I think we're in another one of those big waves to where zero trust is getting talked about quite a bit. Least privilege is a core tenet of zero trust, which basically says, don't give employee A admin to everything, right? You should be only providing the specific permissions needed uh, for that employee's job requirements. This is a reason why there are whole departments at big companies that are just focused on IAM. It's not easy. It is a challenge, but unfortunately, that's what threat actors are looking for. They're looking for accounts that are overly permissive, or they're looking for that account that was in breach data and it wasn't, the password wasn't changed. IAM is a challenge, uh, and a lot of organizations struggle with it. But there's a lot of kind of basic stuff that you can do. That offboarding, IT employee offboarding specifically, you should have a whole procedure around what happens when someone leaves. Okay, first we remove their Asana. Okay, then we remove their SharePoint access. Then we do this with their OneDrive account, right? You should have very specific policies. I think that should be the biggest takeaway here is solidify your employee offboarding processes and policies. That'll save you a ton. So ransomware. So if we think about how they actually do it, they gain admin. So there's a couple steps, but basically when they gain access to an internal network, they need to gain typically administrator privileges. So that's why you saw Kerberos because a lot of times those service accounts do have domain admin. But before they can just go and just encrypt everything, they need to have permissions to copy files and change files on systems across the network. And so they need to gain those privileges to do so. Most of the time, it's domain admin. Of course, there's other roles in Active Directory that might have permission to touch every single endpoint's files. Maybe not make like big configuration changes on the endpoints, but there could be other roles that have that permission. Uh, but at the end of the day, they need to get that permission. Not only that, but they start on one compromised host and basically span out across the network and start just basically copying the encrypting the files on each individual endpoint. What I've seen in the past is they basically run a ps exec command that goes and loops through all of them, all the endpoints, and it copies a an encryptor, runs a command, basically encrypt all files, and then it moves on to the next endpoint. So the thing about that is that they're most of the time sitting on a single host and they're able to access, you know, I don't know, 80% of all the endpoints on that network, which means that those networks are typically flat networks. So there's no network segmentation built into it. Are they're just completely flat. I mentioned MFA before, and one thing that I did want to call out is something that we're starting to see a little bit more of called micro segmentation. So, zero networks, for example, if you wanted to RDP to another host, you need to authenticate again. So, you need not authenticate, you need to be prompted for MFA again, and then it'll let you in to RDP to that host on an internal network now. The way Zero Networks does that is it basically on each endpoint, it shuts down the firewall or it uses the firewall to shut down all the ports except like basic ones. But RDP, for example, the RDP port is closed by default. The RDP service is running on that host, but the firewall closes off that actual port. So when it sees a request come in to the RDP port, Zero Network says, okay, the request is coming from this username on this machine, uh, and they pop up a box, and that user has to complete an additional MFA step before RDPing to that host. So Zero Networks has been around for a few years now, probably 3, 4 years, somewhere around there. But they're starting to be this being adopted more and more in enterprise organizations because it's extremely effective. Uh, so that's one option, but definitely don't have flat networks. Consider microsegmentation such as Zero Networks. And sticking with the flat networks theory, you should have proper, you don't even need to be, the world's greatest network architect. These networks, again, those ransomware actors are typically on one host, hitting all the endpoints across the network. And so if that network is segmented off, they can't hit that. They can't do that. They can only hit the ones that are on their segment. So typically what you see just at a very high level is you'd see a management VLAN, which typically can hit, most things. You'll see a server VLAN, which of course for the servers, and then a user VLAN, which is where all the clients are. A lot of times, I didn't necessarily want to get into the whole discussion around network architecture and that kind of thing, but a lot of times you'll see Wi-Fi VLANs, you'll see guest Wi-Fi VLANs. But the point is that the network is segmented off, and there are specific firewall rules in between those different segments, right? So if you have a management VLAN, maybe one of those firewall rules is only let the MAC address from Core admin to go from management VLAN to server VLAN, right? So even if something ends up in that management VLAN, if you're using firewall rules or some sort of other control, unless they're allow listed, they're not going to be able to move over to that server VLAN. So again, like most of the time, they're just on one host and they're spraying all the endpoints in the organization. And if you're able to block that from a network perspective, yeah, at that point you're already going to have a ransomware incident, but you'll be able to contain it. And not only that, it's going to make it much harder for them to move around the lateral movement that they're doing. It's going to make it much harder for them to move around and actually gain those administrative privileges that they need to actually pull it off and complete the encryption. Uh, One last thing I just want to touch on is continue to segment. Please make sure that IoT is segmented from the rest of the network. I mentioned Akira here recently. Akira ransomware crew was in a network. Uh, I believe they had gained access. I believe they had gained the administrative access that they needed, but every time they tried to do something, like some of those examples Nick was showing, they got caught by EDR. So they ended up in the network. They were on one endpoint. They tried a couple things. They got caught by EDR. They went to another endpoint to try a couple things. They got caught by EDR. Well, what did they do? They said, "Oh, they did." Uh, they looked around the network and they found an IP camera. And the IP cameras run Linux, most of them. Uh, so they connected to the IP camera and they had credentials that they needed, but they were on that camera and using SMB, they connected to all the endpoints on the network and encrypted them. So again, IoT should be segmented away. There's other concerns there, like why didn't the network, why didn't the EDR see that happening and that kind of thing. But you should 100% be segmenting your network, especially when it comes to IoT and high profile assets. So
We did have one question come in, but I figured I would answer it. It was about anti-malware software detecting an intrusion. I would say if you're referring to just like antivirus, like Norton or something, um, typically they're not going to be as robust as like enterprise solutions like CrowdStrike, EDRs, and stuff like that. Um, One of the biggest things is to not have users be local administrator to their own machine because it gives them a lot more flexibility in disabling endpoint detection stuff. So if you're a local administrator on your machine, you can essentially just remove like Microsoft Defender or whatever it is. So that's a big thing is to keep users just low privilege users on their machine. They can't have like high integrity processes or anything like that. And then if it's not in the budget for like EDR, then yeah, I would say like Norton antivirus or some other like enterprise antivirus would be good. But looking into those free options like Wazza and building out your YAR rules yourself. You're going to learn a lot that way, but also you're going to get better detections because they just have more visibility into processes and actions on the host that antiviruses just seem to not uh, be really doing right now.